Hi, everybody. I'm here with a colleague of mine, Nevin Rosaasen.
Good morning, Jen.
Good morning. Who is, what's your title?
I am now the Sustainability and Government Relations Lead here with Alberta Pulse Growers.
That sounds very official.
It does, and it allows me to, get my fingers into the sustainability side and have a lot more focus on water, on climate, on carbon, and certainly on pesticides. And then, of course, I also play the role of government relations, so reaching out to MLAs, MPs, senators, etc., on issues of importance to Alberta pulse growers.
And bringing, I think, maybe the key role you play is making sure there's a strong agriculture voice in all of those spaces.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So this morning, I want to corner you a little bit and talk about a project that we're in the second year on. And we just call it the water monitoring program. But one of the things that I think is important for us to explore is why did we even start this in the first place? So can you kind of actually walk us through the story?
Absolutely. So many farmers would recall back in 2016, 2017, there was a big concern around neonicotinoids, seed treatments that we use here in Western Canada. And the Pest Management Regulatory Agency under Health Canada had actually proposed the phase out of these neonicotinoids as seed treatments. Now, in the absence of real world data, the PMRA has to resort to modeling.
And so PMRA is
the Pest Management Regulatory Agency.
And they are a federal agency?
Yes.
And what's their job?
Their job is to regulate pesticides, and their mandate is to ensure the protection of human and environmental health.
And they fall under the auspices of Health Canada, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
So one of the issues, this is a bit of a side story, but with the mandate is their only job is to protect human and ecological health. So what they don't look at is a cost-benefit comparisons, socioeconomic issues. None of those come into play. So the proposed elimination of neonicotinoids poses a great challenge to the Western Canadian cropping industry because so many of our crops rely on protection at those vulnerable stages when they're seedlings. So the seeds actually absorb a little bit of that seed treatment and it gets them, 15, 20, 25 days of protection against any critters that are out chewing. So certainly flea beetles in canola, pea leaf weevil in peas, even wireworms in some of the cereal grains, and certainly we have a few wireworm pockets here in Alberta.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
So we call them neonics. That's kind of the jargony term. Are they only seed treatments?
No. Neonics are used, they're actually the most used insecticide in the entire world.
So it's actually a really broad category.
Right.
That includes seed treatments,
they're
foliar sprays?
You bet. And so they're also used as a drench in furrows in horticulture. They're used in greenhouses.
Okay.
They're used in orchards and fruit production.
So really broad applicability.
Yeah, they're even used in delicing shampoos, etc.
Awesome.
And one of the reasons they're the most commonly used insecticide in the world is because they're fairly benign. So neonic is a derivative of nicotine. So it doesn't actually kill the insects. It actually only paralyzes them for a short time. And they wise up, and I mean, we do have some insects that are resistant now, but certainly it was one of the most, and is one of the most important insecticides as a seed treatment.
So this PMRA review that was triggered,
right?
They're looking at all uses of neonics.
That's correct.
Not just the agricultural ones.
Well, there isn't really a risk to human health, certainly. If they were used improperly and not according to the label in some applications, they're even used by exterminators in households, etc.
Okay.
So yes, they're used commonly all around the world. And what you mentioned is correct. There was a special assessment. So the PMRA has to reassess or reevaluate all chemistries after a 15-year period because, as you know, science is an evolution, right? And we tend to learn more about products. And certainly it's really important, right? You would recall DDT and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, right? We didn't know that it was bioaccumulating. It posed a huge risk and had a big impact on all creatures within the food web or the food chain. So certainly they play a very important role, and the Pest Management Regulatory Agency here in Canada is well known to be one of the strongest and best regulators in the world.
So actually these reevals are a good thing.
They are. And in the case of neonicotinoids, it was actually a special assessment because we have a policy in Canada where if the EU or any OECD countries ban a pesticide, it triggers an automatic review. So you may recall in Britain, they banned neonics as seed treatments on oilseed rape. And the result is now that many oilseed rape farmers are having to spray 3, sometimes 4 times a season with a non-selective foliar insecticide, which farmers know is your last resort. A, because they're expensive. B, because farmers understand that ecological function is their bread and butter, right? That, open pollinated crops rely on pollinators. Beneficial insects that are in the field, your pests, your predators, parasitoids, right? So this special assessment, like I said earlier, in absence of real world data, the PMRA has to model worst case scenarios with a safety factor of like 3x. So they look at what's called a species sensitivity distribution curve. We're going to get a little sciencey here.
Okay.
So they look at 3 to 5 species. It's usually 5, as per, I believe, OECD regs. And they look at where there's a chronic or an acute toxicity. So chronic would be a long-term exposure and acute would be a one-time exposure event.
Is one worse than the other?
Yes. So acute would mean you hit a certain concentration and that insect has an effect. It doesn't necessarily die, and that effect is only 5% of the population. So, these are lab bench studies that are done, and they don't necessarily reflect real-world situations, right? So we have photodegradation, we have all sorts of different things happening, and so there's also mesocosm studies that are set up by registrants where they build a simulated water environment and hit the environment with a known concentration and measure effect and degradation, etc. So, anyways, all the science stuff aside, when it comes to the PMRA, if they don't have that good real-world data, they have to resort to modeling. And as a close colleague of mine has told me, all models are wrong and some are useful. So what happened in 2017 is that a lot of different provinces, as well as registrants themselves, so those would be the crop protection companies who have the registration and the licenses to the pesticides, set out and started monitoring some wetlands across mostly Saskatchewan, but a couple here in Alberta as well. And what they found...
Wait,
go ahead.
Why wetlands?
So wetlands are the kind of the first point of contact, right? And they are the areas where you would theoretically see the highest concentrations, because in creeks and rivers you tend to have dilution. So you won't see concentrations that are as high in lakes, rivers, and streams or tributaries.
So this is testing for seed treatment chemistry,
right,
that has moved through the soil profile and accumulated in these bodies of water.
Yeah, and they could be ephemerals, which are wetlands or potholes that dry up,
okay,
and that farmers often crop through.
Yep.
And so in these wetlands also the water depth changes as well. So you may seed over a portion of your field that is dry when you seed it, and with a significant rainfall event it may turn into an actual ephemeral. So that qualifies as a wetland and a water body. So you can imagine, and I'm sure every farmer understands, that the water levels fluctuate. So the worst case scenario in the case of neonic seed treatments is that you would seed, the wetland fills up, and now you may have some measured concentration that poses a risk to aquatic invertebrates. And that's what the PMRA was concerned about. This would be midges and mayflies that make up, a big portion of what our fish eat. So we being the industry, went out and measured wetland and measured concentrations of neonicotinoids. And it was very much the Canadian Canola Growers Association and the Canola Council of Canada that led this research. Because as you know, probably 99% of all canola seed is treated with a neonic and perhaps another chemistry. And they found, I believe it was only one case where they had that significant flooding, right, where treated seed was actually floating away and ended up in a wetland. Otherwise, all of their other sites, I believe that it was 27 or 35 wetlands, somewhere in that range, they never saw concentrations of any concern at numbers, and we're talking parts per billion in the case of neonics. So because the industry was able to come up with this great data and show to the PMRA that there was really minimal risk, if any, we were able to retain this important tool in our toolbox as farmers.
Okay, so that kind of sounds like mission accomplished to me.
For 3 chemistries, the 3 neonicotinoids.
Okay.
And they're imidacloprid, thimethoxam, and clothianidin. So
Okay.
I've been working on pronouncing those 3
this
for
right.
5 years.
Yeah.
So that brings us to today.
Yeah.
And the PMRA has had a lot of challenges with, I guess, capacity. Certainly from another program that I work with and group, the Prairie Pesticide Minor Use Consortium, we actually do field testing of certain chemistries that perhaps aren't on the label for pulse crops and other specialty crops. And a lot of our requests to add, say, a chemistry, let's say example, saflufenisol or heat to the label so that it can be used on faba beans. Those requests are taking much longer now. They used to take between 4 and 6 months. Some of them are taking up to 2 to 3 years. So there is a big capacity issue with the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. Brilliant scientists, all very great people. It's just the workload is extreme. So that leads us to this reevaluation schedule.
Okay.
So once a chemistry is licensed and registered in Canada, and that's a really complicated process, we won't get into that, but this reevaluation takes place every 15 years. So there's a list of about 60 what we would call priority chemistries. So chemistries that we know based on sales data and use patterns that are very important to producers here in Alberta. And all of these 60 compounds are up for reevaluation. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation here in Alberta used to actually conduct some water testing, and that included lakes, tributaries, as well as irrigation returns and other streams. However, that's not where, in theory, we'll see the highest concentration. So we're really missing this wetland data. And to be honest, we've lost all of that capacity within Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation. So they used to have over 12 staff looking at water quality. They now have 1. So there's no capacity. So what happened was Team Alberta, the 4 majors, canola, wheat, barley, and pulse, as well as potatoes and sugar beets, decided we better get some real-world data. We better take charge of this situation, or we will potentially lose many of these crop protection products.
So essentially, this is taking a lesson from the neonic reeval and saying, can we actually prevent this or work with the PMRA
Yes.
to remove chemistries?
Absolutely, and
Okay.
working with the PMRA is key. So when we were setting up the original concept, we approached a consultant, a third party, and farmers wanted to have that independent third body in order to get some good advice first on how to build a program, but also to have them sampling wetlands.
And these are people who are specialists in toxicology, in microbiology,
In risk assessment
Okay.
and ecological environmental consulting.
so kind of outside the normal conversations that we would have in ag.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I mean, we put out an RFP in 2017 actually to a few different consultants to actually help us look and understand the risk assessment on neonics. And so we went with the same company this year. Excellent staff and folks there. And we had an initial staging or looking at what we could possibly do. And that entailed meetings with the Canola Council, with other folks who had done some water monitoring. We certainly met with the Canada Grains Council as well to talk about, what were some of the issues. But the most important meetings took place back in 2021. And that's where we actually met with PMRA risk assessors, their water quality group, all of the really incredible scientists. And they helped us rather, design our program so that we could make sure that we were sampling frequently enough, that we were sampling following rainfall, that we also knew that we needed to build capacity in Western Canada for lab capacity. So it turns out that the lab that had been doing some of the surveillance, I'll call it, of streams, tributaries, etc. through Alberta environment weren't actually testing for the pesticides we're using. So we had to develop the methods at the lab for 27 different chemistries or active ingredients. And it actually turned out they were testing for chemistries that aren't even registered or used in Canada as well.
So we didn't know what we didn't know, really.
Exactly.
And then we didn't even know how to ask the questions. Okay, so if we circle back, I guess I'm just going to kind of, what I'm hearing is there was this kind of almost test pilot run with our seed treatments. And we knew that our industry would be exceptionally vulnerable if we didn't enter into this space. So this is brand new in terms of the crop commissions engaging with the PMRA and this reevaluation. And there must have been a period of time where there was a ton of chemistries registered if we've got 60 on our list. And we know that we don't have a ton of chemistries available to us actually in ag to control, and this is herbicides as well as insecticides as well as fungicides.
That's correct.
Okay. And I guess one of the things that I think is so important and so key about this is we are engaging and asking how the PMRA needs the data instead of us just generating data
Right.
and presenting to them, because if it's not the right kind of data, everything has been kind of for naught.
You're absolutely correct.
So we're in year 2
We're in
of
year
this
2.
water monitoring thing. Can you walk me through a season? What does water monitoring mean? What are we testing for? What are the steps? I'm a grad student out in the field. What am I doing?
Right. Well, first of all, we didn't use grad students.
Okay.
We used professionals.
Excellent.
Not that grad students aren't professionals, but we wanted to make sure that we had the quality assurance and quality control first. Everything that you need in order to ensure that that data is good data.
So this isn't just some research study where we're asking questions. We have a clear plan and a clear path to get there that's been well established.
Yes.
Okay.
So where does it start? First, we had to generate our list of 60 priority pesticides between the 6 commissions. We needed to obtain all the reference values for every single chemistry. So that would mean what is the receptor species that they're concerned about.
Okay.
So it might be algae.
And these have all been identified by the PMRA.
Yes. And that process alone took over 6 months.
Okay.
Because for us to go in and to go into each risk assessment and figure out, A, what is the target species or receptor species. It could be algae, could be aquatic invertebrates, could be fish. And then also, what are the limits of detection? So what limit in parts per billion or even 0.0001 micrograms per liter, so extremely low. We're talking 100 parts per trillion in some cases. So what is that limit of detection? Then we had to work with the labs to make sure that they could achieve that limit of detection. So that meant sending away for analytes, so a known dilution of a concentration, and so that they could calibrate their machines to have the peaks if there is a detection. Then we also needed to figure out what were the chronic endpoints, and that would be the long term, and the acute toxicity endpoints. That would be a short term, one-time effect. So once we had this master spreadsheet of all of this information and knew that the lab could actually do these detections, then we could start our season. But we started on time, and we started sampling just after end of April. And it's also important that we decided where we were going to sample. So we actually chose the South Saskatchewan and the Milk River watersheds for 2 reasons. One is we know that vegetative filter strips that we're going to talk about in a minute can mitigate pesticide runoff. And we know that it's very difficult to get a tree or a willow to grow south of Highway 1. So really what we did was we went looking for the worst case scenario where we thought was the most probable area of the province where we might see detections and concentrations above those thresholds.
Okay, now I'm just going to interrupt you again because we talk about wetlands and we've mentioned ephemerals and we've talked about all sorts of things. Wetlands have been grouped into classes, and from what I understand, this project or program has kind of chosen a couple of classes of wetlands to sample.
Yes, we chose class 3 and class 4 under the Stewart-Cantrell.
Which mean nothing to
So
me, so you need
class
to
3
explain to
would be a semi-permanent pond
Semi-permanent pond.
that might dry up in 15 or 30 year dry events.
So in 2019,
Or
when we had
2021.
a ton of rain, it
Oh,
would have been
yeah.
wet all year round. And in 2020, that wetland might have dried.
All of the ones we chose in 2020 had water in them. So they hadn't
entire
dried
season.
out. Yeah, but
Okay.
2021 was our first season.
Okay.
And in 2021, we had the second year, or in some areas, the third year of drought. 1 in 50-year event, and some of our class 3 wetlands dried up. In fact, we chose 10 wetlands to start in southern Alberta, and by the end of the season, 6 of them were dry.
And we're sampling water, not sediment.
That's right.
So water is kind of key.
Yes.
Okay.
So we started sampling, and this project is kind of what we call a storm chaser's whack-a-mole project.
Okay.
Because
I love that.
just we have to follow and sample following rainfall.
Why?
Why? Because that's when you see pesticides move, right?
Okay.
So many of
This
them
is
are water
soil
soluble,
infiltration, yeah.
right? And they'll run overland
Yep.
or even through the soil
Yep.
itself, through the pore water. So we had to chase the storms, and as you can imagine, there weren't a lot of rain events. So we set up a sampling schedule, and we are going to sample every 2 weeks, no matter what. But if there was rain events, then the environmental consultant team would go out and sample right after rainfall.
Okay.
And so we actually tried, and we did get 9 sampling events that were staggered throughout the season, and a lot of them were actually following applications. So the first one might be a preceding burn-off, right?
Okay.
And as well as a seed treatment, right? Then probably after your first in-crop herbicide, and then maybe after a fungicide or an insecticide application.
So it's actually helpful to us to hit those intersects of when there's been some sort of chemistry applied to the
Right.
field to see actually how much is moving through soil water
Yeah,
into our wetlands.
You bet.
Okay. Connecting dots.
yeah. So we did 9 sampling events.
Okay.
And we sampled 10 wetlands, and we also sampled some tributaries.
So define a tributary.
A tributary would be a slow-moving creek.
Okay.
And I'm not an expert on the classification of streams and class 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know what they were, to be honest. But we wanted to sample them at the locations where we had real live data from Alberta Environment.
Okay.
So they actually have inflow meters. So it gives us an idea of peak flow. It gives us an understanding of the hydrology within the watershed as well. And what we found out after year 1 is that we had minimal, if any, detections, not exceedances, but detections in tributaries. And really, if we needed that information, it's publicly accessible, usually, those tributaries. So you can have government employees easily access those tributaries. However, wetlands are a totally different beast. They are on private land, which means that not only did we have to educate our consultants, they have experience from oil and gas with clubroot and soil pathogen protocols, right, for sanitation, using booties, etc. We also had to ensure that they had good trust and relationship with the farmers, so that fell on us as commission staff to build that trust. We also needed really key data and information from our producers, and that's pesticide use and application history. We not only asked them what they applied, but what was the wind speed, what was the nozzle type, what was the active ingredient, what was the rate per acre. All of that information is so important because we can go out and test wetlands and say we didn't find anything. But that data is no good to the PMRA. Unless they have pesticide use history for the adjacent field next to the wetland, they can't knock that chemistry off their list as safe.
Right, because
So
we
that-
need to know A, it was applied, and B, it was not detected or detected at concerning levels
Yeah.
for them to say this is safe or not safe.
And that's the whack-a-mole part.
Right,
So
okay.
every time we have an application of a chemistry and we can ensure that there's no detections, not only that season, but the next season, we've whacked that off the list. And that's an important part because a lot of the fungicides that were applied, we saw no detections in 2021. But when we returned to these wetlands in 2022, all of a sudden we saw a detection of that active.
Okay.
So it's tied up in that plant vegetation. And it's not until you have a significant spring rainfall event, especially since we had such a dry fall last year,
Right.
that we see that moving into wetlands. But remember, this was not at levels of concern. This is just a detection. We're talking, again, parts per billion.
Okay, so we've talked kind of about the process, a little bit about the reason why we're doing this, and this is, I would say, us as an agricultural industry being exceptionally proactive.
Absolutely.
Now I'm sitting here as Farmer Jenn, saying, you know, and Evan, this is all awesome, but it really doesn't affect me, kind of in my day to day, right? So, I think it's nice to know that we're doing this kind of in the background, because if our job turns out good, it means that farmers will actually not be impacted, right? We'll still have all of the tools in the toolbox.
Right.
But for somebody who's concerned about being an exceptional steward of my land, what are some things that, in light of what we're learning in this water monitoring program, that I need to think about?
And that is the key question. It's one thing to go out and sample and provide this data or evidence to the PMRA.
Which I'm really glad you're doing. Good job.
But the other thing is to ensure that we're actually using pesticides according to the label. Now, I'm sure you've been involved in some of the pesticide application on your farm at one point or the other, or choosing the active ingredient you're using. And on the label, the most important part is first, the PPE, the protective equipment that you need to wear to make sure that you're safe, but also the environmental considerations portion of the label.
Okay.
So this is something that'll be the key research portion of this project, and that is getting a better understanding of the efficacy of vegetative filter strips to mitigate pesticide runoff. So on your label, it may say a 3-meter vegetative filter strip is required. In fact, some labels require a 10-meter vegetative filter strip in the case of certain insecticides. Now, we've communicated this to the PMRA just a couple weeks ago in Ottawa, how it's impossible for farmers to take a 3-meter vegetative filter strip around a wetland and make it a 10-meter vegetative filter strip, right? So what we also have to adhere to are the buffer zones or the spray offset. So certain chemistries will require not only a 3-meter vegetative filter strip. Some of our insecticides that are applied require a 10-meter vegetative filter strip. Very difficult for...
Okay, hold on. Vegetative filter strip is perennial cover?
That's correct.
Okay.
So
that changes things.
Yes. And I mean, certain areas of Alberta, in the south, for instance, it was very hard to even find 10 wetlands. A lot of those wetlands, through the history of the irrigation districts, have either been drained or they've been made into irrigation channels. Etc. So, I mean, it was difficult to locate 10 producers and 10 wetlands. But in certain parts of central Alberta and in the parkland region, prairie pothole region, for instance, we have a lot of wetlands on the landscape. So the environmental considerations portion of the label is so important for farmers, for pesticide applicators to adhere to. And not only did we go out and photograph these wetlands, we also have some drone imagery, some video that really provides a better understanding of what these look like on the landscape, especially for the regulator, the PMRA. So that when we look at a wetland and we submit the data, or we show the data, present the data, they get a better understanding of what it looks like, right? And not only did we do that, but we hired this amazing adaptation and resilience training project assistant, Haley, and she was fantastic, a Veg ID champion, so to speak. And she managed to identify, I think, over 75 different species of perennial grasses, sedges, rushes, etc. in southern Alberta. And so we have not only measurements of the width of the vegetative filter strips that vary from wetland to wetland, we also have an estimation of the percent ground cover of what are the dominant species. And we also got to see, when some of the wetlands dried up, of course, all of the different wildlife tracks. So all of the mammals, the bird species, I mean, the insect species were as diverse as you could imagine. So the biodiversity learnings surrounding those wetlands reinforce the stewardship that's taking place on the landscape. So we even had some wetlands that didn't have the minimum 3-meter vegetative filter strip that's required. And we were really concerned. That wetland also had fish. But you know what, Jen? We did not have a single exceedance of chronic or acute toxicity in any of our 185 samples that we collected last year.
So could this potentially then, like, I'm thinking about, some of our fields where, we have some pretty knob and kettle kind of topography. If I'm thinking about 10 meters, up to 10 meters around every one of those, I've lost, 30, 40% of my field. Is there opportunity then through some of this data collection to go back to the PMRA and say, can we look at adjusting some of these vegetative filter strips? What's the kind of looking at the opportunity costs and maybe through some of this advocacy work make things a little bit more realistic?
Absolutely. And that is one of the final it was one of the last steps of our presentation to the PMRA, is showing them how, like you described it, knob and kettle, or all of these potholes on the field, that farmers, if they were to actually have a 10-meter vegetative filter strip for those specific insecticides.
And am I legally responsible to have that 10 meters?
You are.
I could.
Yes.
Oh dear.
So we made the point that, and we had aerial photos from an airplane of, an extreme, it wasn't necessarily an extreme weather event, but that spring thaw, that freshet, all of those potholes full. And I mean, the staff were astonished at how much of that field would be consumed. And I mean, it would be literally impossible to have a 10-meter, let alone a 3-meter vegetative filter strip in some fields.
Okay.
So certainly those are fields of concern. And, this second year in 2022 field season, we moved north and we picked up 10 additional wetlands in kind of the Three Hills, Trochu, Linden area. And we still had our network of 10 wetlands that we're continuing to go back to, but only 6 of the 10 have water this year.
Okay.
So 4 were remaining last year, 2 recharged with some of those late rains in July. And that was important for us to go back as well, because when you have an extreme dry cycle, you might have quite a few actives that were applied to the crops, and that residue sitting there. Once you get rainfall, that would be, in theory, a worst case scenario. And that's what we're looking for, worst case scenarios. And we got the question from a few farmers, Nevin, why are you going looking for this?
Yes, yeah.
And the answer is, if we do not provide good examples and proof of our stewardship, we're at risk of losing so many of these tools in our toolbox.
So I actually think that sums things up really nicely as to why it's important that we as commissions representing, in our case, pulse farmers, but in this project also canola and wheat and barley and sugar beet and potato farmers, that we have to go there and we need to engage in this conversation, because the PMRA is literally just doing its job. But if we don't provide the context, then sometimes they can come down with these things that maybe aren't necessarily applicable. And I know one thing, and we won't even go into it today, but their recommendations are Canada-wide, and we're taking a very prairie perspective and suggesting that potentially, maybe some of this stuff needs to be considered for Eastern Canada and Western Canada, as opposed to, based on use patterns, etc.
Right.
So, we've got 2 years down. How many more years are planned?
We have funding for 1 more year.
Okay.
And that's an important part of this as well, is because farmers felt that there should be government funding in place for this, which traditionally government did and still does some surveillance. But it's really not a monitoring program when you're dipping a sample from a tributary every so often.
Right.
So we really wanted to do a target monitoring program. And we did apply for funding, and we were successful to get funds from ARDAR, from the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, as well as from 3 registrants. So Bayer, BASF, and Syngenta also helped support. So we were able to leverage farmers' dollars 6 to 1. So again, registrants loved that we had a third party doing the water monitoring, and that remains a concern because the PMRA is undergoing a transformation. We won't get into all of the steps, but transparency and open data is something that they're pushing for. And they're actually recruiting citizen scientists to go out and monitor and take samples. And this is of great concern to the industry. We also have environmental NGOs.
Okay, just wait. A citizen scientist.
Right. So you may have heard of Concerned Citizens for Science and some of these other environmental groups.
Okay.
The PMRA has said that they will take data from anybody because they really need real world data. So we've raised this concern with the PMRA multiple times that we need to have trained professionals, not necessarily grad students heading out, because I remember, when I was, when my wife was doing her graduate studies and I was out taking water samples, totally different project, but I can say with confidence that I had no idea what I was doing, right? And that's not to say all grad students don't, but we need to have that level of professionalism.
As a scientist, that gives me the EBGBs because procedure and protocol and precision and consistency is so cornerstone.
Right. And field blanks, trip blanks, duplicate samples, all of the things, the chain of custody for samples is so important. And using a commercial lab that has the analytical capacity to reach those limits of detection. I mean, you need to have samples on ice. They need to be extracted within 7 days. There's a whole chain of custody. So this is something in regards to a project where there's two things. One is to provide that real world data to prove stewardship and that pesticides are being used according to the label with vegetative filter strips and that there is no risk. And we haven't had any detections above those thresholds. Number two is we're going to get a much better understanding of vegetative filter strips, their ability to mitigate pesticide runoff, the species composition, what is in them, how they work, what height is required, etc. Currently, our guidance is to actually go out and to mow the vegetative filter strips around wetlands to limit the height to 18 inches. And also to avoid compaction, which aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So we're working with Ag Canada, we're working with the PMRA. We have all of this great information. We have one more year of funded water monitoring, and certainly we hope to have more of those chemistries used. We certainly have covered all crop types. We've even had fields that have had hemp, dill, corn, grazing corn.
Yep.
So even some of those commodities that aren't necessarily represented by commissions in Alberta, we're getting good use pattern data for those crops as well.
Cool.
It is a cool project.
Awesome. Well, thank you for enlightening me and taking the time today.
Thank you, Jen.
And if we have further questions, you're kind of our key contact?
You bet. Send me an email, tag me on Twitter. I'm at APG Extension. Send me a DM. Happy to have a conversation with any farmers who have interest or concerns about the project.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Nevin.